In our last session, we looked at Joseph being imprisoned as the result of a inappropriate, or Potiphar's wife inappropriately charging him for something that he didn't do. She had her designs on him, one, because he was just really attractive, and two, Potiphar was a eunuch, so he wasn't able to have marital relations with his wife. And we noticed that she probably already knew this because she probably married him knowing either that he was already a eunuch or she agreed to him becoming a eunuch so that he could work for Pharaoh. But it was important that we understand the dynamics that are taking place in this family so that we can see what God is doing here. The text that we looked at in our last session was introduced by saying, "And it came to pass after these things." Now remember, Joseph was an overseer in Pharaoh's house. He'd been placed there. That was the second time he had received elevation to overseer status. His father gave it to him after Reuben had sinned by having intercourse with one of his father's concubines. So here's Joseph. He's in prison now. He was elevated to be the head of the household for Potiphar, who was the chief executioner under Pharaoh. He spent about 13 years under Potiphar, and the last 7 years was probably in prison. There's only one prison incident in the Bible, and it's this one. And it's really important that we understand this because Joseph was in a political prison. And the Psalms tell us that he was in fetters and he was tortured. We just don't know to what degree. I can only assume that because Potiphar liked him and knew what his wife was like, that he was given some special treatment there in this prison. And we're going to see in our next session next week that Joseph is going to be elevated for the 4th time to the office of prime minister. And this would happen at his 30th birthday, or about his 30th birthday. And it's important to understand that the Bible teaches that the age of 30 is the age when people in responsible positions get elevated to their office. The priests in the Old Testament Mosaic law, the Kohen, they were required to be 30 before they could become a priest. And Jesus started his ministry about the time of 30 years of age. So in the Old Testament economy, we see that 30 years of age was about the time when people were accepted as being mature enough to have heavy responsibility placed upon them. The two men that were in the story last week that we looked at were well aware of the relationship that Pharaoh, Hyksos, had with the Egyptians. The Hyksos, as we had seen in earlier sessions, had taken over Egypt starting, they were Semitic, and they came and took over the eastern Nile Delta region, gradually moving to Lower Egypt and then to Upper Egypt. And they were not well liked by the Egyptians. So there was a lot of political intrigue in the high office of Pharaoh and the people that reported to him. These guys, the cupbearer, also known as the butler, and the baker, surely described the political events to Joseph while he was in prison all this time. They had both committed offenses to Pharaoh. And they were strong offenses. One, it turns out to be, was a capital offense. They were eunuchs, and as all of the men were that reported to Pharaoh, were close to Pharaoh, which would, in their mind, protect the Pharaoh's harem and hopefully subdue any aggression that might be engendering Pharaoh's political position there. So the first guy that's mentioned is this cupbearer, and it was his responsibility to make sure that the wine and the drinks that came to Pharaoh would be pure, free from poison, and he had the responsibility of administering that program. They both these guys had to be above reproach because both of them were going to be responsible for the quality of the food that was going to come to Pharaoh. And there is a tremendous amount of political intrigue in any high power positions because somebody's always striving to get that power away. Now, we have a relatively easy transfer of power here in this country through the electoral process, but that may not last long. It doesn't in other countries. The elections are all basically bought and or thugged. So it may look like there was a free election, but back here, Pharaoh was an absolute autocrat. He was in complete control. Joseph is over these guys in prison as the overseer. He's been placed over them, and it's through that responsibility he's able to minister to them. Now, Joseph had been a dreamer. We saw that that's what landed him in Egypt to begin with because his brothers were jealous, but he didn't interpret those dreams to his brothers. His father and his brother provided the interpretation. But in this instance, Joseph is now asked to interpret these dreams. He's going to start doing this. These dreams to the baker and the butler, the cupbearer, if you will, it caused them great distress. And they had free access to Joseph, and we can only assume that these guys also had free access to the magicians. That would be the false prophets, if you will. But none could give them any satisfaction to the dreams that they were having. Joseph makes the simple statement to them, do not interpretations belong to God? And even though people are going to dream dreams, only God can discern these dreams. Joseph, being a child of God, says, tell me, I pray you, tell me your dream here. So the cupbearer tells his dream first, and he brings out, almost simultaneously, the development of a grape into wine. He said, I saw its buds, its blossoms, and its grapes becoming ripe. Then he saw Pharaoh's cup, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup. This is to say that he took these ripened grapes and he gave Pharaoh juice. I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And it's important that we notice this because in this dream, the butler, if you will, is personally involved in the administration of that wine or that grape juice to Pharaoh. He wasn't a distant participant. Now, there are 3 branches and 3 terms are used to describe the grapes. And Pharaoh is mentioned 3 times. And the cupbearer also uses a personal pronoun, I, which in Hebrew it's ani or anoki. 3 times he says, I took, I pressed, I placed. And it's important we understand that because it gives us this sense of his deep involvement with this process. And he was confident that he'd carried out his responsibilities competently, and he didn't do anything that he shouldn't have done. So Joseph begins to interpret this dream for the cupbearer, and he says, the 3 branches are 3 days. Within yet 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head and restore thee unto thy office, and thou shalt give Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. Now, Joseph knew this was not an ordinary dream. It was a prophetic dream. He sees the hidden meanings here. He knows that this is a special dream that's got these sets of 3 in rapid succession discussing the grape's development, and he knows that the restoration of this man's office under Pharaoh is going to happen in 3 days. Pharaoh was going to have a birthday in 3 days, and it wasn't a basic birthday. It was as the Egyptians used to call it, a rebirthing. They had this ceremony elevated to a really high level because they didn't just say, hey, we're having a birthday party. We're having a rebirthing. And I don't fully understand what that is, but in the lexicon of Hebrew, it discusses a sense of a massive celebration that has more significance than what we would have for a birthday party, for example. And in 3 days, Joseph is saying, you're going to be raised back up to this position of honor, and all will be well. Joseph was really confident that this guy was going to be back in his office. He didn't flinch at all when he told him this. And he told him his captivity was his personal captivity was unjustified. He said, hey, when you get restored, you tell Pharaoh that I'm here and shouldn't be here. I was stolen away. I was sold, I was brought here as a slave. I'm not born into slavery. My parents weren't slaves. I didn't ask for this. Please tell Pharaoh, plead my case for him. And Potiphar and the cupbearer both reported to Pharaoh. Now, Potiphar was responsible for having Joseph in prison because he placed him there. I think Potiphar was also pretty cognizant of what his wife was like. So Joseph wasn't killed. Joseph could have easily been killed. Here's the chief executioner putting him in prison for his wife accusing him of adultery, which he didn't do. So Potiphar had to do something. He had to do something with him because his wife is announcing this to their staff, basically to the world, so he's got to do something. And Joseph wants this guy, the cupbearer, to do something for him. Now, this cupbearer had no political motivation to do anything for him because he knew that he'd be going up against Potiphar because they both had the same rank reporting to Pharaoh. He's just getting out of prison now, so he really doesn't have any motivation for making himself a persona non grata in Pharaoh's court. So he doesn't do anything. Then it's the chief baker's dream that comes up. Now, on the heels of the prophetic dream of the cupbearer, also known as the butler, we've got this not so good fortune in the dream of the baker. He tells Joseph a dream that's filled with these negative images. This was in contrast to the positive image that was given by the cupbearer. He says there were 3 baskets of food on his head, and the uppermost basket was food for Pharaoh. Now, the cupbearer participated personally in the delivery of the grapes, or the wine, I took, I pressed, I placed. The baker, though, wasn't actively participating, and that's the difference here. It was on his head, waiting to be served, and then these birds come in the image of this dream and take away the food. So others were prepared to do for him what he should have been doing for Pharaoh. Food wasn't placed on a suitable plate. It was left in wicker. And these birds come and they eat it. He didn't even attempt to drive the birds away from the king's food. He was incompetent in the way that he carried out his responsibilities. He just didn't appear to have any interest or commitment to his responsibilities. Therefore, it would have been an endangerment to Pharaoh's life. He hadn't done what he was supposed to do in the way that he was supposed to do it to protect Pharaoh. So Joseph interprets this dream, and he states that the person is not going to be restored, but he's going to be executed in 3 days. He's going to be beheaded. Then he's going to suffer the honor of having his body hung on a tree for the vultures to eat the flesh. Now, it's helpful to know that the Egyptians at that time thought that your body was required in the hereafter. Therefore, they went to great extents to embalm bodies. Even the common person would get his body embalmed, because they thought they were going to use them later. To have somebody suffer this dishonor was just loathsome. And it just implied that the baker was not worthy of even having his body available in the hereafter. Now, Joseph sees success after 3 days in the interpretation of both of these dreams. On the king's birthday, Yom Huladet, that's, again, the day of being born, the text says that the cupbearer was restored and the baker was executed. Now, because of the nature of the text that's written and the degree of familiarity with the Egyptian practices, we think that Joseph was the writer of this section of Scripture, and then Moses would be the compiler of the book of Genesis. So Pharaoh gives a feast, and he lifts up the heads of both prisoners, but in different ways. And the cupbearer forgot Joseph. He didn't do anything, as we expected, but that's going to change. That's going to change in the text that we're going to look at today. Now, as I read through, starting in Genesis 41, about Pharaoh's dream, just realize that the old word for cattle is kaina. Kaina refers to cattle. And starting in Genesis 41, verse 1 to 8, the text reads, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, well-favored and fat-fleshed. And they fed in the reed grass, and behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 ears, thin and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh." So the text opens here with a declaration of after 2 years. So it's after 2 years since Pharaoh's birthday, 2 years before, and the prophecies of the cupbearer and the baker had been fulfilled. Joseph's still in prison, and the cupbearer didn't do anything in terms of putting a good word in for him with Pharaoh. It just wasn't politically expedient. But what is so important for us to gather here in this story is that even though Joseph spent about 7 years in prison, he never lost his love for God, his recognition that God was in control and God was going to work his plan, God's plan, out through his life. And if you don't get anything else in this story, just look at what God does with Joseph. And don't look at this and say, well, that was Joseph. No, it's you too. It's me too. God has a plan for our lives. And what we are going to be doing, how we can touch other people's lives, and what our time on this earth, as short as it is, will be for God, for the God of the universe. It's interesting that the dreams of Pharaoh came in pairs. The dreams of the butler and the baker came in pairs. The dreams that he had, that he told his brothers before they sold him, came in pairs. The dreams that Pharaoh experienced involved the Nile River. I don't know if you know this or not, but Egypt is completely engulfed by the Sahara Desert. There is no rain there. And if there's ever been any rain there, it didn't make it to the ground. There just isn't any. If you've ever lived or been in a region where it's all desert, like I was in Saudi Arabia for a while, there's no clouds. There's just nothing. Absolutely nothing. But brilliant blue sky and baking sun all the time. There's nothing growing. There's just nothing. The Nile is the life source for that country. And the water that comes from the Nile, as it floods, as rivers all do, they have seasonal flooding where the river exceeds its banks. It's that wide margin that provided the agricultural spot for food to grow. And the cattle were all there. They were down in the reeds on the banks of the Nile. That's where they were. It's the life source for Egypt, that Nile River. Now the first dream, it's got Pharaoh standing by the Nile, and he sees these 7 stout cows there where they would normally be feeding, and then he sees 7 gaunt cows that come out of the river, and they approach the stout cows and they eat them. So he wakes up, he's, wow, it's a dream. It didn't bother him too bad though, so he goes back to sleep. Then he has another dream. And the second dream does bother him a lot because the text of the Hebrew there shows us that this really disturbed him. I mean, he was troubled in his spirit, as our English text says. There was 7, there was one stalk with 7 ears of, my Bible says corn, but it's actually grain. And that comes up, and then another stalk with 7 dry ears comes up, and it eats the first 7, similar to what happened with the cows. Now, this one really blew him away. I mean, he woke up from that one, and he was really, really troubled. And it's real typical in this country that the winds coming from the east, either from the Sahara or from Arabia, which is all desert too, would prevent the Nile from flooding. And when that happens, the Nile doesn't flood and the agricultural situation gets really dim because there's going to be a famine. They're going to have to import food. And it wasn't so easy to do back then. The 7 dry ears ate the 7 healthy ones. And Pharaoh realized there's something wrong here. There's something radically wrong. Something's going to happen. And he was really unsatisfied with the fact that these pagans couldn't give him a good representation of what these dreams meant. Now, it's also important for us to understand that a cow in their religion, this ancient Egyptian religion, was a representation for their god Isis, the god of fertility. And Osiris, the god of vegetation, was represented by a bull. Now, he knew that there was something of importance here. He just didn't know exactly what it was. And these Egyptian magicians couldn't do anything. We see these guys expertly practicing their craft, and basically their craft was just demonic because they didn't know Yahweh. We see references to them doing the same thing in Daniel 1:20 and Exodus 7-9. They just couldn't satisfy Pharaoh with a decent explanation. These dreams came from God. They didn't come from the occult. So he didn't have that connection. And he knew that they weren't going to be able to satisfy him. Now, the next section of scripture we're going to look at shows us that the cupbearer finally speaks up. He finally tells Pharaoh what it is that he should have told him 2 years before. The text in Genesis 41, verses 9-13 reads, "Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us there a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream did he interpret. And it came to pass as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. Now, the cupbearer, as we've looked at, just knew it wasn't politically expedient for him to say anything before because he was going to be going up against Potiphar. Now the situation has turned around. He can endear himself to Pharaoh by bringing Joseph out. So he tells the story. He says, you know, when I was having all these tough times, remember you put me in prison and so on? He says, well, there was a guy there that interpreted dreams and was very accurate, very, very accurate. I was restored. And obviously the baker was not. But he's going to help Pharaoh now with Joseph's gifts. And the political intrigue here is really interesting because if Joseph can satisfactorily interpret Pharaoh's dream, then the cupbearer is going to be a hero. Man, I got you. I connected you to the right guy here. You know, this is me that is doing this. And if Joseph fails, then Joseph is just a failure amongst all the other failures that came to Pharaoh. So the cupbearer's not going to lose either way. He's not going to lose either way. If Joseph failed, then there's just simply no interpretation to be had. That's all. The cupbearer never speaks of Joseph's ability to do this. He just says, I remember this guy who did so-and-so. And he says that, the dream, he was one evil and one good, and he was accurate in what he did. But he never promotes Joseph to say, man, you ought to get this guy. He just lets him know this guy's in prison. So Pharaoh's impressed. He quickly gets him out of prison. And because the Egyptians were clean-shaven and the Semites weren't, according to the way we have seen the pictures in the caves in Egypt, Joseph shaves, or somebody shaved him. And my guess it's Potiphar that is over the prison there is saying, look, if you're going to go meet with Pharaoh, you're going to have to get shaved, you're going to have to get clean, here's some good clothes. They wanted him to be presentable to Pharaoh. Again, all political. Potiphar reports to Pharaoh. The cupbearer reports to Pharaoh. Potiphar wants to look good now that the cupbearer is getting closer to Pharaoh than Potiphar is. So he makes his best appearance before the king. And I'm sure Joseph is thinking, man, here's an opportunity maybe to plead my case. Finally get out of here. I'm finally getting the ability after 2 years. So the text moves on, starting with verse 15 to 24, and this is where Pharaoh now starts speaking to Joseph. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that when thou hearest a dream, thou canst interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the brink of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke, and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up upon one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. Pharaoh begins his discourse by relating the failure of the magicians, the soothsayers, these guys that supposedly had the capability of telling Pharaoh what was going to happen in the future and or the meaning of his dreams. And then he says this to Joseph. He says, when thou hearest a dream, thou canst interpret it. In other words, I've heard this of you. I've heard this of you. Joseph says very, very quickly, which is important for us to understand here. Again, Joseph relies on God. He says, God will give Pharaoh. It's not me, but God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So he's not saying that the dream will be to his liking, or you're really going to enjoy what you hear here. I can fill you in on the details. He's saying, no, God is going to give you an answer of peace, meaning satisfaction of knowing exactly what this means. The genuine dream, the genuine meaning of this dream is going to remove Pharaoh's anxiety about knowing what it is. There's anxiety about the unknown, always. Joseph realizes that, and what he's basically saying to Pharaoh is, God's going to take that anxiety away from you. He's going to give you his peace. Now, this ability of God to give us peace and God being in control is also given to us in Proverbs 21:1, where it says, the king's heart is in the hand of Jehovah as the watercourses. He turneth it whithersoever he will. In other words, just as God can change the course of a river, he controls the king's heart. He has the king do whatever it was that he wants him to do. So it's another verse that shows the degree of control that God exerts in this world. This guy, Pharaoh, he's an absolute autocrat. He's in complete charge. There is nobody that has any more authority in that land than him. He can kill people. He can raise people up. He can do whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. But God controls him. And that's what Joseph is trying to get through to him. God will tell you. God knows these dreams. God controls things. And Pharaoh's desperate. You know, Joseph has made a bold step here by saying something to Pharaoh that there's somebody in more control than you. It was a pretty bold step for Joseph to say this. Pharaoh then recalls the dream, but he adds two components to retelling this to Joseph that weren't in the original dream, at least as it was given to us. He says that the thin cows were worse than he's ever seen. I mean, I've never seen them like this before. The worst of the worst. And these famines were pretty frequent there when these sirocco winds came from the east. And after the thin ones ate the stout ones, they were still gaunt. They never got fat. In other words, they continued to be gaunt and needing food. And he went on to describe those winds. They're called the sirocco winds, and they come either from the Sahara, the eastern part of the Sahara, or they come from Saudi Arabia. It's just Arabia back then. He just says, Pharaoh just says, you know, nobody can decipher these dreams. Then Joseph speaks, starting in verse 25 to 36. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. What God is about to do, he hath declared unto Pharaoh. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 lean and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years, and also the 7 empty ears, blasted with the east wind. They shall be 7 years of famine. That is the thing which I spake unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he hath showed unto Pharaoh. Behold, there comes 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine which followeth, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh, as it is, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint overseers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. And the food shall be for a store in the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt. And the land perish not through the famine. So Joseph begins interpreting this immediately after Pharaoh tells him what it is that he has dreamed. And that there's a sense of urgency here. I mean, Joseph has just gotten out of prison, and he's hoping he can stay out, and he's hoping this is his opportunity to stay out. And Pharaoh is very grieved at what he has dreamed. So you can just sense the tension here at court. The magicians, could not translate the dream. And here's this slave Hebrew they bring out of prison to do it. And so Joseph's got a lot riding on this, and he gives it all to God. He just gives it all to God. It's overwhelming for him, but he gives it all to God. And he tells Pharaoh that the 2 dreams are the same. When things appear, the same story emphasized in the Bible, God wants us to pay attention to it. And that's what he's doing here. He's given this dream in 2 different ways, but it's the same dream for emphasis so that we pay attention to it. Joseph says, what God is about to do, he hath declared unto Pharaoh. And Daniel, later on, about 598 or so BC, is going to do the same thing to Nebuchadnezzar. We read about this in the 2nd chapter of the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar is going to receive an image in a dream. And he doesn't know what it is, and nobody can tell him. The magicians can't tell him. Joseph tells Pharaoh there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, and it's going to be a very, very difficult time for all the people that live there. And the Nile flooding is going to stop for 7 years. Now, Joseph then gives him a strategy that he should implement, and he tells him how to go about doing it so that they will be able to make it through this period. He says to Pharaoh, you appoint a wholesome, trustworthy, and effective economic czar or economic minister to handle this problem, and as well as overseers to implement it throughout the whole land in all these different cities. Joseph suggests then a 20% tax. Now they had a 10% tax at that time, and a 20% tax could have been looked at as confiscatory. They don't like the Hyksos to begin with, and now they're taxing us at 20%. But the level of production in a bumper crop was going to be so much in those first 7 years that the citizens were not going to notice that the tax was higher. They still were going to get their yield. They were going to be okay. So they weren't going to see any negative effects of this. This tax is going to virtually go unnoticed. The food is going to be stored around various locations where it's going to be visible and accessible, so that the people are going to know that what's taking place here is genuine. This is not somebody stealing our food. This is somebody that really believes something bad's going to happen. So they went along with it. They agreed to it, and it was appropriate that somebody that was chosen to do this would be honest, and that honesty was going to come through because their genuineness was going to come through. When the famine struck, Pharaoh would be well liked in his kingdom because the Egyptians didn't like the Hyksos, and now Pharaoh was seeing this as a good way for him to endear himself to these people. They'd taken over militarily, and nobody likes to be occupied. Even if it's justified, nobody likes to be occupied. So here's a chance for Pharaoh to endear himself to the population, and he'd be the savior of Egypt. He wouldn't have to rely on his military to keep control of these people, which is what they had done up to that point. Now, in our next session, we're going to look at Joseph being elevated to prime minister. Pharaoh sees in Joseph what Joseph is telling him are the characteristics of the person that really needs to be in charge here. Amen? Let's pray.